When your entire life fits inside a single duffel bag, you stop thinking about the future. You start thinking about tonight, where you will sleep, whether the $20 folded in your back pocket will stretch to cover a meal and a bus fare, whether anyone in the world would notice if you simply disappeared. My name is Eli Vance. I was 21 years old, and I had a philosophy degree, $217, and an eviction notice taped to the door of my dormitory room. The notice was crisp, official. The university letterhead was almost cheerful in its clean blue font, the kind of document that had been designed to communicate institutional decision rather than human consequence. It informed me in the polite and impersonal language of institutions that my occupancy of room 214 in Carver Hall had ended as of the previous Friday. Graduation was over. The grace period was over. The real world had arrived, and it had arrived not with fanfare or possibility or any of the things the commencement speaker had promised 3 days earlier in the university gymnasium, but with a deadline and a door that no longer opened with my key card. I stood in that hallway for a long time. The fluorescent lights buzzed above me with the particular frequency of things that have been running too long without maintenance. The carpet worn thin by a decade of students who had all gone somewhere after they finished here smelled of stale coffee and old ambition and the specific kind of institutional cleaning product that never quite removes the evidence of the lives lived on top of it. Everyone else was gone. Their boxes had been packed, their parents' minivans loaded their futures carried away to apartments in cities I had never been to. I was the last one left in Carver Hall. I had nowhere to go. My mother, Sarah, had died when I was 6 years old. A highway accident on a Tuesday morning in October, the kind of ordinary catastrophe that changes everything permanently and explains nothing at all. There is no meaning in a Tuesday morning accident. There is only the before and the after, and the long work of learning to live in the after. My father had never been part of the picture at all, just a name on a form my aunt had once shown me. Without comment, a man who had moved on before I was old enough to remember a face or a voice or the particular way a person takes up space in a room. I had been raised by my mother's younger sister, a woman named Deb, who had her own 3 kids, her own small house in a suburb of Denver, and her own quiet exhaustion that she carried everywhere, like a second coat she could not take off. She was not a cruel woman. She was a tired woman, and there is a difference. Though from the inside of childhood, it is not always easy to tell what that difference is. She had taken me in because it was the right thing to do, and she had fed me and clothed me and made sure I finished high school. And when I left for the university on a partial scholarship 4 years ago, she had hugged me at the bus station with a relief she tried to disguise as pride. I had let her disguise it. It seemed like the kind thing to do. There was no bedroom waiting for me at Deb's house when I finished. That room had been converted to a sewing space before I finished my freshman year. She had mentioned it in a phone call almost as an aside, and I had said that was fine, which it was because I had understood by then that the arrangement had always been temporary and that the end of it had been written into the beginning. I sat on the strip mattress in my empty room and looked at the walls where my posters had been at the pale rectangles where they had kept the paint from fading ghost shapes of the person I had been for 4 years in this room. I opened my phone and scrolled through job listings for what felt like the 100th time, but was probably more than that. Entry-level position requires 3 to 5 years of experience. Must have reliable transportation. Will not consider remote candidates at this time. It was a joke I no longer had the energy to find funny. I had applied to over 100 positions in the 3 months leading up to graduation in cities across the state and beyond it for jobs that ranged from the marginally relevant to the completely unrelated to anything I had studied. 2 interviews, 0 offers. The market, it turned out, was not in any particular state of desperation for 21-year-olds who had spent 4 years thinking carefully about Aristotle and Kant and the nature of moral obligation and what it means to live a life that is genuinely good rather than merely comfortable. My student loans were real in a way that Aristotle was not. The cold dread that crept up my spine that afternoon was not new to me. I had felt it before in its earlier and rawer form standing at my mother's graveside in the October rain when I was 6 years old, holding Deb's hand and not yet having the language or the cognitive architecture to understand what permanent meant. Only understanding that something very large had changed and that the changed thing was not going to change back. I had felt it lying awake in the small room at Deb's crowded house, listening through the thin walls to the sounds of a family that was functioning and complete and not quite mine understanding in the way children understand things without being able to articulate it, that I was adjacent to belonging rather than inside it. It was the feeling of being untethered, of being a ship that had slipped its anchor in the night and was drifting towards something dark and final that it could not see clearly enough to steer away from. I sat with that feeling for a while. Outside the window, the campus was quiet and golden in the late afternoon light, the kind of beauty that feels almost insulting when you are frightened because it has no interest in your situation and will be equally beautiful tomorrow, whether or not you have solved your problem. That was when the email arrived. The subject line was simple and gave nothing away. It said only, regarding the estate of Raymond Vance. I almost deleted it before reading it. I had received enough fraudulent emails in my adult life to recognize the general shape of false hope, and this one had several of the hallmarks. An estate, a name I barely recognized, a message that had arrived at the exact moment of maximum desperation, as if someone had been monitoring my circumstances and had chosen the optimal moment to make their approach. People who study vulnerability for a living know that the most effective moment to offer someone an exit is when they have just run out of other options. But the name stopped me before my thumb reached the delete button. Raymond Vance. Ray Vance. That was my grandfather's name, my mother's father. I had heard that name spoken exactly twice in my life, in moments separated by years, and both times it had been said in a way that closed the subject rather than opened it. The first time I was very young, maybe 4 years old, and I had found an old photograph tucked in the back of a drawer in my mother's bedroom while I was looking for something else. The photograph showed a man with large, capable hands and a serious face standing in front of a mountain range I did not recognize. He was not smiling, but there was something in his expression that was not unhappy either. It was more like concentration, or perhaps assessment, like a man looking at something far away and trying to calculate the distance and what the distance meant. I had brought the photograph to my mother and asked who it was, and she had taken it from me gently without anger and said only, "That is my father," in the tone of voice that adults use when they are answering a question while simultaneously indicating that the question is finished. And then she had put the photograph back in the drawer and closed it, and I had understood that I was not to ask again. The second time I heard the name was at her funeral. I was 6 and I did not understand most of what the adults around me were saying, but I understood tone and register, and I heard Deb's husband say something about trying to notify him, and I heard Deb say there was no point. He had been gone since before Sarah was grown. And then the subject changed. Gone. That was the word they settled on. Not dead, not estranged, not absent. Just gone the way a season goes or a weather pattern goes present for a while, and then not the space it occupied closing over behind it. I opened the email. It was from a law office. Wyndham Legal, based in a town called Coldridge in western Colorado, a name I had never heard. The attorney's name was Clara Wyndham. The email was brief and formal and stated that Raymond Vance had passed away in May of the current year, that I had been identified as his last known living descendant, and that as such I was the sole heir to his estate. It asked me to contact the office at my earliest convenience to discuss the details of the transfer. Assets. The word did something strange to my exhausted brain, expanding and contracting simultaneously, filling with possibility and then deflating against reality in the same breath. Assets could mean anything. Assets could mean a broken lawnmower and a box of hand tools and some old furniture that nobody wanted. On the other hand, assets was a word that lawyers used in professional correspondence, and in my experience, lawyers did not generally trouble themselves over broken lawnmowers. I dialed the number before I had fully decided to do so. My hands were moving while my brain was still catching up. The phone rang twice and then a woman answered. Her voice was measured and clear, the voice of someone who has delivered difficult and complicated news on a regular basis over many years and has learned to do it without either cruelty or false comfort. Wyndham Legal, she said. This is Clara. I told her my name. I told her I had received the email this afternoon. My voice was steadier than I had expected it to be, which surprised me. Eli, she said, I'm glad you called. I've been trying to reach you for a few weeks. The university address I had was out of date. She paused briefly. I want to be straightforward with you about what your grandfather left behind because I think you deserve honesty rather than inflated expectations. Raymond did not have much in the way of liquid assets or conventional property. What he had was land, 5 acres in the mountains outside Coldridge. It's his and now it's yours, free and clear. The deed has already been transferred to your name. 5 acres, I said. 5 acres, she confirmed. I should tell you that it's not what anyone would call prime real estate. The ground is rocky and steep in places. On the north side of the property, there is a significant granite cliff face, a large one. There was a cabin on the land at one point, a small structure that Raymond built himself, but that burned down in 1991. The county assesses the parcel at just over $1,100 for tax purposes. I said nothing for a moment. Burned down. Rocky. $1,100. The words stacked up in my chest, one on top of another. There is one other thing, she said. Her voice shifted almost imperceptibly, becoming careful in a way that it had not been before. There is a company called Ridgeline Corporation that has been actively acquiring land in that particular area of the mountains for a number of years. They have been making offers on your grandfather's parcel for over a decade. He refused every offer they made. Their current standing offer is $20,000 for the deed, as is no contingencies. $20,000. I closed my eyes. I did the arithmetic automatically the way you do when you are frightened, and your brain reaches for numbers because numbers feel more controllable than feelings. $20,000 was a security deposit in first and last month on an apartment. It was a used car that would actually start in January. It was food for a year and breathing room for 2, and a chance to try again without the clock counting down to 0. It was not a fortune, and it would not solve everything, but it was a ladder. It was the most direct exit I had ever been offered from any difficult situation. But he didn't take it, I said. You said he refused every offer. For over a decade. That's correct, she said. Why? There was a pause on the line that lasted long enough to be deliberate. That she said is something I think you should come out here to answer for yourself. She paused again, and when she continued, there was something in her voice that was neither encouragement nor discouragement, but something more like a careful neutrality that had been earned rather than assumed. There is also a safe deposit box at the bank here in Coldridge. Raymond left specific instructions that the contents were to go to you. I have the key here at the office. He left instructions for me specifically, I said. He didn't know me. We never met. She was quiet for a moment in the particular way that people are quiet when they are deciding how much of what they know to say. He knew who you were, she said finally. He followed your mother's life from a distance for many years. He knew when she passed. He knew about you. She paused. He was not a man who talked at length about the things that mattered most to him. But everything he did was deliberate. Every single thing he left behind was left on purpose for a reason. After I hung up, I sat for a very long time on that bare mattress, with the plastic rustling faintly underneath me, and the eviction notice rustling in the draft from the hallway, and the campus, golden and indifferent outside the window. $20,000. The answer, the escape, the clean, simple, available exit, or a dead man's refusal, a burned cabin, 5 acres of rock that a company had been trying to buy for a decade, and a man had spent a decade refusing to sell. I had a philosophy degree and $217 and nowhere to sleep tomorrow night. I sold my textbooks the next morning. 4 years of undergraduate reading the physical accumulation of everything I had been taught to think about and think with went to the used bookstore 3 blocks from campus for $62. I stood at the counter and watched the clerk stack them to one side without opening them, and I felt nothing about it, which told me something about where I was. I sold my laptop to a sophomore in the computer science building who paid $100 in cash without haggling, which meant I had asked too little, but I did not have the energy to negotiate. I kept my phone, my sleeping bag, a single change of clothes, a jacket that was adequate for September but would not survive a real winter, and a worn paperback copy of Epictetus that I had carried since high school because it was small and because the Stoics had useful things to say about the management of circumstances you cannot control. I bought a one-way bus ticket to Coldridge, Colorado. The journey took the better part of 2 days. I sat by the window in the middle rows where the ride was smoothest, and I watched America change outside the glass. The flat, bone-dry expanse of the eastern plains scrolled past in the way that flat landscapes do each mile, looking like the last mile, the sameness of it, almost meditative, if you were in the right frame of mind, which I was not entirely but was working toward. Then the land began to shift. Slowly at first, just a heaviness at the horizon, a suggestion of elevation that could almost have been weather. Then more decisively, the ground folding upward, the color deepening from the brown and pale yellow of the plains to green, and then to the particular blue-gray of high-altitude pine forest. The Rockies came up like a decision, like something that had made up its mind a very long time ago and had never been talked out of it. At the bus stops along the way, I ate from vending machines and thought about Ray Vance. I thought about the photograph in the drawer in my mother's careful, closed voice when she handed it back. I thought about what it meant to refuse something for a decade. Not to fail to accept it, not to procrastinate, or to get around to it eventually, but to actively, repeatedly, definitively refuse. Every year, Ridgeline had made an offer, and every year my grandfather had said no, and then another year had passed, and they had asked again, and he had said no again for a decade in a trailer at the edge of a small mountain town on a retired miner's savings that Clara had described as almost nothing. Whatever was on that land, he had thought it was worth more than $20,000 in a comfortable life. I wanted to understand that. I needed to understand it in the specific way you need to understand something when your own decision about it is still open. Coldridge was smaller than I had constructed it in my imagination from the name. It sat in a narrow mountain valley between two parallel ridgelines, and the valley had the feeling of something held carefully between two hands, contained and specific, cut off from the larger world in a way that was not quite isolation, but was definitely distinction. The main street was 4 blocks long. There was a hardware store with paint cans in the window, a diner with a hand-lettered menu on a chalkboard outside a post office that shared its building with the county assessor's office, and a general store with a hand-painted wooden sign that said, Braille's, in letters that had been touched up enough times that the original underneath was a different color. Above the hardware store, reached by an exterior staircase with an iron railing, there was a small office with Wyndham Legal stenciled on the glass door in gold paint that had begun to chip at the edges. I climbed the stairs with my duffel bag on my shoulder. The stairs were steep and the iron railing was cold in the September air. The door opened before I had knocked, which meant she had heard me on the stairs or had seen me from the window, and Clara Wyndham was standing in the doorway. She was in her early 60s, silver gray hair cut short and practical, the kind of haircut that communicates that the person wearing it has made a decision about what matters, in appearance beyond a certain functional threshold, is not on the list. Her eyes were sharp and direct, and not unkind. The eyes of someone who has seen enough of the world and enough of what people do to each other that surprise is no longer a readily available reaction, but who has not allowed that experience to curdle into cynicism. She looked me over once briefly, and without any particular judgment, taking in the duffel bag and the road-worn state of my clothes and the specific quality of exhaustion that comes from 2 days on a bus, followed by several weeks of sustained anxiety, and she gestured me toward a chair. "Sit down, Eli," she said. "You look like you could use a moment." I sat. The chair was old leather, worn smooth in a way that was comfortable rather than shabby. The office was small and organized, every surface holding something that had a purpose and was in its place. A wood-framed window behind Clara's desk looked out over the main street, and the ridge beyond it, and in the late afternoon light, the granite of the upper ridge was almost orange. She slid three things across the desk to me. The property deed, a single page in a clear sleeve with my name on it in the language of legal transfer. A county tax assessment form that confirmed the land was valued at $1,140, and a heavy cream envelope with the Ridgeline Corporation logo embossed in dark blue in the upper left corner. That's their written offer, she said, $20,000. They have called my office 4 times since Raymond passed. They are eager to resolve this. I looked at the envelope. I did not pick it up. Before you make any decisions, Clara said, I think you should see the land. It's about a mile up the logging road east of town, an easy walk if you're used to hills. There's a gate with the Vance name on it that's hard to miss. She paused. And there's the safe deposit box at First Mountain Bank 2 blocks down. Raymond was very specific in his instructions about the key. He wanted you to have it before you made any decisions about the offer. She slid the key across the desk. It was small and tarnished brass that had been handled many times over many years, the kind of object that carries the memory of hands in the way its surface has worn. I looked at it for a moment before I picked it up. He left these instructions for me, I said. A person he had never met. She was quiet for a moment. He knew exactly who you were, she said. She said it in a way that indicated she meant it precisely and not as a comfort. He kept track of your mother's life as best he could from a distance, and he knew about you. She folded her hands on the desk. I won't tell you more than that because it isn't mine to tell. The land will tell you what you need to know and the box will help. But I want you to see both before you sign anything or decide anything. I thanked her, and I went back down the stairs, and I stood for a moment on the main street of Coldridge with the key in my jacket pocket and the late September sun on my face. The air at this elevation was different from Denver air or Boulder air, thinner and sharper, carrying the smell of pine resin and cold stone, and something that I did not yet have a name for, but that I would later come to understand was the specific smell of high mountain water, the mineral clarity of water that has come through granite rather than soil. I walked 2 blocks to the bank and asked to access the safe deposit box. The teller, a young woman who looked at my duffel bag and the state of my hands without visible reaction, led me to the back room and left me alone with the box. It was the size of a shoebox. The key turned smoothly, which surprised me given how old it looked. I lifted the lid. Inside were 6 leather-bound journals, compact and dense, the kind made for longevity rather than elegance. Beside them, 3 folders of documents, some photocopied and some original, held together with rubber bands that had hardened with age. 2 photographs face down, and on top of everything, folded precisely into quarters, a large piece of drafting paper that made a sound like a quiet complaint when I unfolded it. It was a hand-drawn map. Ray Vance had either been trained as a surveyor at some point or had taught himself to think like one, because the map was detailed and precise in a way that amateur drawings rarely are. It showed the 5 acres in careful plan view, with compass orientations marked and rough elevation, contour lines sketched in pencil. Every significant feature of the land was noted. The old cabin foundation near the base of the cliff, the property boundary lines on 3 sides, the logging road and the gate, and 3 locations circled in ink, each with a label in his small, cramped handwriting. The first circle was labeled Spring Source Clean Water, Year-Round Flow, tested 1994 and 2007. The second circle was labeled Mineral Deposit, Rare Earth Composition Geological Survey on file. Both of those made a certain kind of sense, the kinds of things that would make a piece of otherwise rocky and inhospitable land valuable to a development corporation with long-term plans. Water rights and mineral rights were the underlying grammar of land value in the Western Mountains, and Ridgeline would have known that from the beginning. But there was a third circle. It was positioned at the base of the cliff face in the vicinity of the burned cabin's foundation. Beside it, Ray had written 4 words, the 4th mark. And below that, in slightly smaller letters, follow the north wall, east 40 feet. Look for the iron ring. I folded the map carefully and put it in my jacket pocket with the key. I looked at the 2 photographs. The first was a picture I recognized the feeling of before I recognized the content, my mother as a young child, maybe 3 or 4 years old, wearing a yellow coat and looking seriously at something outside the frame of the photograph. She was not looking at the camera. She was concentrating on something the way children concentrate when they have decided something is important and they are going to give it their full attention. She looked like someone I had known, which of course she had been, though not for long enough. The second photograph showed a man standing on a piece of rocky high ground with a granite cliff visible behind him. He was in his 30s or 40s, lean, with the kind of physical economy that comes from years of labor rather than from exercise as a separate activity. His hands were large. He was not looking at the camera either. He was looking at the cliff. His expression was the same one I had seen in the drawer photograph when I was 4 years old. Calculation assessment, the face of a man trying to understand the distance between where he was and where he needed to be. I put the photographs back and closed the box and walked out of the bank and started up the road east of town. The logging road climbed steadily from the first step. The pavement lasted for half a block past the edge of town and then became gravel, and the gravel lasted for another quarter-mile and then became a rutted dirt track that angled upward into the trees with the casual authority of a path that had been there a long time and expected to be there a long time after you were gone. The pines on either side were old-growth tall and widely spaced, the understory beneath them open and rocky. The light came through in long angles, and the shadow of the ridge fell across the track in a diagonal that moved slowly eastward as the afternoon progressed. After about 40 minutes, the track bent to the right and then straightened, and there was the gate. It was iron rusted to the particular orange-brown of old metal that has been rained on for decades, leaning slightly to the left on hinges that had not been properly hung to begin with or had shifted over time. A piece of weathered wood old enough that the grain had silvered completely was wired to the crossbar with wire that had also rusted. The letters had been painted on in what must have been dark paint once, but most of it had flaked away, and what remained required you to be close and looking directly at it to read it. Vance. I put my hand on the gate and pushed. It shrieked on its hinges, a sound that was loud in the pine-filtered silence of the hillside, and swung inward, and I stepped through onto my own land for the first time. Clara Wyndham had not been imprecise in her description. The ground was chaotic in the specific way of mountain ground that has never been cleared or worked, a tumble of stone and exposed root and hardy, wind-abbreviated pine trees that grip the thin soil with the determination of things that have decided they are going to live, regardless of what the terrain has to say about it. The land climbed steeply toward the north, and there, filling the entire northern boundary of the property, and rising well beyond it, was the cliff. It was granite, pale gray in the afternoon light with veins of darker stone running through it in patterns that suggested the enormous pressures that had formed it. It rose sheer for what I estimated to be 150 feet before it broke into the rougher, less vertical terrain of the upper ridge. It dominated the entire property, the way a wall dominates a small room, making everything else on the land feel relative to it, scaled against it. Standing at the base of the slope and looking up at it, I understood in my body rather than my mind something about geological time, about the age of stone, about how long things can stand that are built correctly and placed in the right ground. I worked my way up the slope, grabbing at roots and outcroppings, my city shoes slipping occasionally on loose gravel. Near the base of the cliff in the shadow where the granite blocked the afternoon light, I found the ruins of the cabin. It was not much, a rectangular foundation of stacked stone, the kind of careful, dry-laid stonework that requires patience and an understanding of how rocks fit together, blackened in places where the fire had touched it more than 30 years ago. The stones themselves were solid, the work of someone who knew what they were doing, but the structure they had supported was gone, reduced over 33 years of Colorado winters and summers to a few charred timbers, lying in slow, dignified collapse, half returned to the soil that surrounded them. Weeds and small plants had pushed up through every crack in the foundation stones. The whole thing was being quietly, unhurriedly swallowed by the mountain. I stood in the center of the foundation and tried to understand it. A man had built this with his hands. He had laid these stones himself one on top of another, learning the weight and shape of each one, and then he had built walls on top of the stones and a roof on top of the walls. And he had lived here alone on this steep and rocky piece of ground that no one else wanted. And then someone had set fire to it while he was sleeping inside it, and he had gotten out with the coat on his back and the boots on his feet, and he had not left. He had moved into a trailer at the edge of the town below, and he had kept coming back up here to this burned foundation, to this land for 33 more years. I walked the full perimeter of the 5 acres in the remaining afternoon light. It took longer than it should have because the ground was difficult, and I was not yet reading it correctly, not yet understanding where to put my feet on the steeper sections. On 3 sides, the property bordered trees, and through the trees, at irregular intervals, I could see survey stakes planted in the earth with orange plastic flags on top of them. The stakes had the deliberate placement of professional survey work, and they were marked with the kind of notation that suggested they had been put there by someone who intended to do something with the information. They surrounded the Vance parcel on 3 sides like a description of something waiting. The only side that had nothing waiting for it was the north side, the cliff, the 150 feet of ancient granite that could not be bought or moved or negotiated with. The afternoon light was going amber and horizontal by the time I came back to the ruins of the cabin. I had not made any decisions. The $20,000 had not stopped being $20,000. The exit was still open, the cream envelope still on Clara's desk, ready for my signature. But I was going to spend at least one night here, on this ground that had my name on it now by legal transfer, if not by anything else. I found the flattest section inside the old stone foundation and cleared it of loose stones and decades of accumulated leaves, pushing them to the side, with my hands and feet working by the last of the day's light. I was going to roll out my sleeping bag here and spend one night on the land and try to understand in the specific way that places sometimes communicate with you when you are quiet enough to listen what it was that Ray Vance had seen when he looked at it. My fingers hit metal when I was clearing the ground, not stone. The texture was wrong and the sound it made against my fingernails was the wrong sound. I stopped moving and held still for a moment. Then I brushed at the earth more carefully, the way archaeologists brush slowly and with attention. The edge of something flat and metallic appeared under my fingers. A latch, I thought, or the corner of something with a latch. Military style. The kind of container built to survive conditions that would destroy ordinary containers, designed in the specific logic of things that need to last, regardless of what happens to the people who put them somewhere. It took me nearly 15 minutes to work it free from the earth. The soil had packed around it with the density of ground that has not been disturbed for 2 decades, and I had to use a stick as a lever, and then my fingers as tools, and then the full strength of my arms and legs braced against the foundation stones before the thing finally came loose, with a sound like a seal breaking, like pressure equalizing. I sat back on my heels in the ruins of my grandfather's cabin and looked at what I had found. It was an ammunition can military surplus, the kind made of steel, with rubber gasketed latches designed to keep the contents dry under conditions that would ruin anything less engineered. It was heavily rusted on the outside, but structurally intact. The latches were stiff with age and rust, but not fused. I worked them one at a time carefully, and they gave way with sounds like things exhaling after being held for a long time, releasing pressure that had built up slowly over years. The lid was heavy. I pried it open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that Ray had used to create a barrier against any moisture that might work its way in over the years, was a stack of leather-bound notebooks, small and dense, packed in tightly. Beside them, a bundle of envelopes tied with cotton twine that had gone brittle with age. Beneath those, a drawstring canvas bag. And resting on top of everything, placed there deliberately and with care, was a small carved wooden bird. I picked up the bird before I touched anything else. It was a sparrow, or close enough to a sparrow that the distinction did not matter much. Carved from a single piece of pale, close-grained wood, every feather rendered by hand with a tool that had been controlled by someone who had done this many times and understood the material and was willing to take the time the material required. It was small enough to rest in the center of my palm. and I recognized it without being able to immediately explain why. And then the explanation arrived. I had seen this bird before. Not this specific bird, but its twin. My mother had kept a carving exactly like it on her bedside table, and when she died, it had been the one possession of hers that I had asked if I could keep, and it had traveled with me ever since, wrapped in a sock in the zippered pocket of whatever bag I happened to be carrying. I had it with me now. My grandfather had made two of them, one for his daughter, one for the grandson he had never met buried in the ground to wait for whoever came to find it. The canvas bag held money, old bills and paper bands, the kind of currency that had been saved rather than recently withdrawn stacks of it in denominations that added up when I counted them with hands that were not entirely steady to just over $10,000. I set the money aside on the foundation stones and I opened the letter. It was not a single page. It was 6 pages written on both sides of each sheet in a hand that had been precise once and had grown somewhat shakier in its later sections, the way handwriting does when the person writing it is older or tired or feeling the weight of what they are trying to say. The ink was faded to the soft brown of age. The date at the top was 2003, which meant Ray had put this box in the ground 21 years before I found it. He had buried it and closed the lid and walked back down the hill to his trailer in the town below, and then he had continued for another 21 years the long and patient war that the box was part of. He began with my name, not Dear Eli, not to my grandson, just Eli. The way you begin when you have been thinking about someone long enough that the formality of greeting seems unnecessary when the name itself carries everything that preamble would say. He told me his story the way a man tells things when he has stopped caring whether he sounds good and started caring only about whether he sounds true. In 1989, he had been working a copper mine in western Colorado, the kind of mine that hired men on short-term contracts and paid them well enough to keep them from asking too many questions about safety protocols. There had been an accident in a lower shaft in March of that year, the kind of accident that the industry called a routine incident in its reports, and that the men who were in it called something different: a collapse. Ray had been badly injured, his right leg, his back 3 ribs, and a hearing loss in his left ear that never fully resolved. The mining operation was owned by a company that was the direct corporate ancestor of what was now called Ridgeline Corporation, the names having changed through mergers and acquisitions the way corporate names do, while the underlying entity in its institutional memory remained continuous. They had denied liability. They had denied his workers' compensation claim on the grounds that he had failed to follow safety protocols, which was not true, but which they had the documentation to assert. And when he had fought back, had found a lawyer willing to take his case on contingency and filed a formal complaint with the state labor board, they had done something simpler and more effective than winning in court. They had made phone calls. Word had gone through the networks that connected mine operators and construction companies and the various contractors who supplied labor to them, and the word was that Raymond Vance was a troublemaker, a litigious employee, a risk. The word was efficient, and it was thorough, and it was devastating. He had not been able to find work in mining or heavy construction or any of the skilled trades for years after. He had been too proud to go home to his wife and daughter with nothing. He wrote that plainly and without the softening language that people sometimes add when they are admitting something they are ashamed of. He said it was the wrong choice. He said he had known it was the wrong choice even as he was making it, and he had made it anyway because he was 26 years old, and he had been broken in a way that made the prospect of being seen broken by the people he loved feel worse than the alternative. He had retreated into the geography of his shame instead of returning to the people who would have helped him carry it. He had bought this land with the last of his savings, 5 acres of rock and scrub in steep, difficult ground, backed against a cliff that made it useless for any conventional development purpose, which was why it had been available at a price he could afford. He had built the cabin with his own hands, and while he built it and after it was built, he had started paying attention to what he was actually sitting on. He had contacts in the geology community from his mining years, men who owed him information, if not money. He had engaged cheaply and quietly a surveyor who had done work for him before and who could be trusted to keep the results private. And over the course of several years, he had assembled a picture of the land that explained everything he had not previously understood about why Ridgeline wanted it. The cabin burned in February of 1991. He had been asleep when it started and had gotten out with very little, and he had stood in the February snow and watched the structure he had built with his own hands take 20 minutes to become ash and charred timber. He had never been able to prove arson in any court to any standard of proof that a judge would accept. But he knew he had been asking questions that Ridgeline did not want asked, and he had been refusing offers that Ridgeline needed accepted, and the fire was the clearest possible answer to both of those things. He wrote they thought that would be the end of it. They thought a man who had already been broken once could be broken again with fire and cold, and the removal of the one physical shelter he had. They were wrong about that. I moved into a trailer at the edge of town, and I kept going. I kept records. I kept the land. I kept asking questions. Every year they made an offer, and every year I told them the same thing. Not for sale. And every year they waited for me to change my mind, and every year I did not. The letter was not sentimental in its structure. It did not ask for understanding or offer easy explanations for the choices he had made. He had not made contact with his daughter or his grandson because he had believed and had evidence to support the belief that Ridgeline was capable of following threads of connection and using them as leverage. He had protected his family by keeping them unaware. He knew that sounded like the kind of thing a man told himself to make a hard and selfish choice feel noble. He said that explicitly. He said he was not asking to be thought well of. He was only asking that what he had done with his life be understood as having been done for a reason. Near the end of the letter, his handwriting changed. It compressed and slowed as if the words that remained were being chosen with particular care. He wrote, "The money in the bag is what I managed to put aside. It isn't much for what I'm asking, and I know that. Take it and take what Ridgeline is offering and go build yourself a life somewhere that makes sense. There is no shame in that, Eli. You owe me nothing at all. Nothing. But if there is something in you that is stubborn in the right way, if you can look at this piece of ground and see what I saw in it, then stay. Do not sell it to them. Because what they want from this land is not what they have told anyone they want. And if you go to the bank and open the box I left there, you will begin to understand what I mean." He signed it Ray Vance. Not grandfather, not with love. Just his name, the way you sign something when you want the signature to be the thing itself and not a performance of the thing. The sky had gone completely dark while I was reading. Dark at altitude is a different quality of dark than city dark or even suburban dark. There is no ambient glow to soften it. The stars over the Colorado mountains at that elevation were dense and close, and the Milky Way was a physical presence across the sky, a river of light above the granite cliff face. And the silence was the kind of silence that feels alive rather than merely absent, full of the small sounds of the mountain at night, the wind in the high pines, the distant sound of water moving over stones somewhere. I sat in the ruins for a long time. The $20,000 was still sitting in an envelope on Clara's desk. The exit was still open. In the morning, I could walk back down the hill and sign the paper and be on a bus by afternoon and in Denver by evening, and I could begin the ordinary survivable work of building a life from a different starting point. It was a reasonable plan. It was the kind of plan that people in my situation made, and most of them were not wrong to make it. I picked up the brass bank key from where it had been sitting beside me on the foundation stones. The bank opened at 9. I was on the steps at 10 minutes before 9. I went inside and accessed the safe deposit box, and I came back out onto the main street of Coldridge with the map in my jacket pocket and a direction to follow. I walked back through town toward the logging road. On the main street, I passed the general store with the hand-painted sign. A man was on the porch working through a stack of crates with the unhurried precision of someone who has done this task so many times, it no longer requires conscious attention. He was heavy-set and in his early 60s with a gray beard trimmed close and the kind of physical deliberateness that comes from decades of work rather than from working out. He looked up when I passed. "You're not from around here," he said. It was not a question, and it was not unfriendly. It was simply accurate. "No," I said. "I'm staying up at the Vance property for a little while." He set down the crate he was holding. He looked at me for a moment in the particular way of someone who is deciding how much weight a piece of information carries. His name, which I would learn later, was Fergus Braille. He had operated Braille's general store for 30 years. He had known Ray Vance. He said nothing. He picked up the next crate and went back to work. I kept walking. I was halfway up the logging road when I heard an engine behind me, and a black SUV came down the track from above, moving faster than the road warranted, and pulled to a stop beside me with the practiced ease of a vehicle that stops where it intends to stop. The window came down. The man behind the wheel was in his mid-50s, tanned and clean-shaved, wearing a jacket that had been made somewhere that understood what expensive fabric felt like. He had the particular kind of smile that some people develop when they spend their professional lives in situations where they need other people to feel comfortable quickly. The kind of smile that is technically warm and actually neutral. He introduced himself as Preston Cole, Regional Director for Ridgeline Corporation. He said he was glad to have the opportunity to speak with me directly, that these matters were often easier to discuss between people than through intermediaries. He hoped I was finding the property to be everything I was expecting. I said I had just arrived the previous day. He nodded as though this confirmed something. He said that Coldridge was a beautiful part of Colorado, but a demanding one, that the winters here were serious business, even for people with experience of them, that it was not a comfortable place to be without resources and a proper structure to shelter in. He understood that I had come into this situation unexpectedly, and he wanted me to know that Ridgeline's interest in making the transition easy for me was genuine. The offer of $20,000 was fair, he said, and it was ready to be completed anytime I chose. I looked at him for a moment. I said my grandfather held this land for 33 years. He refused your company's offer for 33 years. He died in May, and it is September, and you are talking to his grandson about making things easy. Cole's smile did not change in any way I could measure. He said, "That's right." I said, "I'll let you know." The window went up and the SUV eased past me down the road toward town. I stood still for a moment after it had gone, listening to the engine fade. Then I turned and kept walking upward toward the gate, toward the cliff, toward the iron ring that Ray had described in his careful handwriting on the map, and toward whatever the fourth mark was buried under 33 years of refusal, waiting for someone to come and find it. The iron ring was exactly where the map said it would be. 40 feet east along the base of the cliff, measured in my own rough paces, and there it was. Set into a natural seam in the granite at about knee height, almost completely concealed by a mat of gray-green lichen that had been colonizing the rock face for decades. If you were not looking for it specifically, you would walk past it every time for years for the rest of your life and never see it. It was the size of a large door handle, forged iron, gone the dark color of old metal, bolted into the crack in the stone, with hardware that had been chosen for longevity rather than ease of installation. I pulled. Nothing moved. I repositioned my feet in the loose gravel at the cliff's base, getting lower, getting my weight underneath the effort, and pulled again with my legs and back instead of my arms. There was a grinding sound from deep in the stone, low and reluctant, and a section of the cliff face that was not actually cliff face shifted outward by an inch. I stepped back and looked at it. It was a slab of granite, roughly door-shaped, about 4 feet tall and 2 feet wide, that had been worked free from the surrounding rock at some point and rehung in its opening on iron hinges that had been set into the stone with a precision that must have taken considerable time and skill. The slab had been seated back into its frame so carefully that the seams were indistinguishable from the natural cracks and joints of the cliff face. Ray had not simply found a gap in the mountain. He had made a door in it. The slab swung outward on its hinges, which had been packed with grease at the time of installation and were still, against all reasonable expectation, functional. Behind it was darkness and the smell of cold stone, and underneath that smell something dry and slightly papery, like old documents in a room that has been sealed for a long time. I used my phone as a light and ducked through the opening. The chamber was not large. perhaps 12 feet deep, 8 feet wide, with a natural ceiling that curved upward in the center to a height just sufficient to stand upright. The floor was packed earth covered in wooden planks that Ray had laid at some point running lengthwise to keep things off the ground and dry. Against the back wall, bolted to the stone to prevent them from shifting in any settling of the ground, were two metal shelving units of the kind found in garages and utility rooms. On those shelves, arranged with the methodical precision of someone who understood that organization was not a luxury, but a functional requirement of the work, were the records of 33 years. Binders, dozens of them, each labeled in Ray's small and economical handwriting along the spine. Corporate filings organized by year. State water rights documentation. Survey maps in multiple versions, originals and copies clearly distinguished. Correspondence, both outgoing and incoming, with notations in the margins about what had and had not been replied to. Newspaper clippings in clear plastic sleeves, each dated. Legal documents that I did not yet have the expertise to interpret, but that had the specific weight and density of things that had been obtained at cost and kept for a reason. And in one corner, wrapped in heavy plastic sheeting and sealed with tape that had yellowed with age, a package that Ray had labeled in large letters, evidence. Original documents. Do not copy. Delivered to legal counsel. I stood in that space for a long time. Ray Vance had lived in a trailer at the edge of Coldridge for 33 years. Every Tuesday morning, he had walked 2 blocks to Fergus Braille's counter and had a cup of coffee. Every week or month or season, he had driven up the logging road and climbed the slope and opened the stone door and added something to the shelves. He had built this room with his own hands, installing the shelves and the floor planks and the hinges, and he had filled it over the course of 3 decades with the documentation of a wrong that had been done and never accounted for, and he had died with it still incomplete, and he had trusted that whoever came after him would know what to do. I photographed every shelf, every binder spine, every visible document before I touched anything. Then I took the sealed evidence package under my arm, pulled the stone door closed behind me, and walked down the hill to Clara Wyndham's office. She looked up when I came through the door, and then she looked at what I was carrying, and something in her expression changed in a way I had not yet learned to read. I put the package on her desk. He had a room, I said, inside the cliff itself, behind a stone door he built and hung himself. There are 2 shelves full of organized records in there. This was labeled for legal counsel. She looked at the package without touching it. Then she looked at me for a moment. She said, "Sit down, Eli." I sat. She opened the package, carefully cutting the tape with a letter opener rather than tearing it the way you handle something you understand to be significant. Inside were 3 labeled folders and a handwritten index, a detailed list of what each folder contained and where each original document had come from. She read for several minutes in silence. I watched her face. The professional composure she maintained did not break, but something behind it became very still, the specific stillness of a person who is processing information rapidly and seriously and organizing it into categories of meaning and consequence. "These are originals," she said finally, "not copies." "He kept the originals in the cliff room," I said. "Copies in the binders on the shelves." She set the folders down and folded her hands on the desk. Raymond spent the better part of 30 years trying to get someone with authority to look seriously at Ridgeline's water rights filings in this county. He believed they had fraudulently represented the source of the water they were claiming rights to. If these documents are what the index says they are, he may have been correct. She paused. "This is beyond the scope of my practice, Eli. This requires federal involvement." I nodded. I told her I would bring the other materials down from the cliff in stages so we could go through them systematically. She agreed. As I stood to leave, she said my name and I turned back. She said, "Don't mention what you found up there to anyone yet. Not until we understand what we're holding." I went back up the hill that afternoon and I started clearing the ground for the foundation. The Quonset hut plan had assembled itself during the long night in the sleeping bag, with the cliff at my back and the stars overhead. A conventional structure was out of the question for reasons that were obvious. I had no construction skills, no meaningful budget for materials, no crew and ground that was too rocky and too steeply sloped for a standard foundation. But I kept looking at the cliff, 150 feet of solid ancient granite, already vertical, already a wall. The best wall that would ever exist on this property. If I could build 3 walls and attach a roof and use the cliff as the fourth side, I could reduce my material requirements by a significant fraction and anchor the entire structure to something that was not going anywhere, regardless of what the weather did to the rest of it. A Quonset hut was the answer. Semicircular, corrugated steel arches, the same basic technology the military had been deploying since the Second World War, for exactly the reason I needed it. Cheap, structurally sound designed to be assembled by unskilled labor, with basic hand tools capable of handling weather loads that would compromise conventional framing. You could order a kit. The manufacturer in Denver could ship it to Coldridge on a flatbed. I could anchor the arches to a concrete slab poured against the base of the cliff, and the cliff itself would form the rear wall of the structure. It was not a house, but it was shelter, and shelter was the first requirement. I researched the county permit requirements at the public library using a desktop computer that ran slowly and had a screen that flickered at intervals that were just frequent enough to be distracting. Clara had been correct that a standard residential building permit would take months, possibly longer, and would involve inspections and code reviews and the attention of a bureaucratic process that was not designed to move quickly. But an agricultural structure, a barn in the legal definition, a storage facility for equipment or materials related to land use, had a different regulatory pathway. The requirements were specific about certain things and silent about others. I read the relevant sections of the county code 3 times to confirm what I thought I was reading. I ordered the Quonset kit on the library computer, paying from raised cash. The manufacturer confirmed delivery in approximately 14 days. That gave me 2 weeks to prepare the site. What followed was the hardest sustained physical labor I had ever attempted. The site I had chosen was at the base of the cliff, the flat patch of ground that would form the foundation pad. Flat was a relative term. The ground there was a mixture of loose rock, compacted gravel, and irregular shelves of bedrock that had no interest in being moved. My tools were a shovel, a pickaxe, and a wheelbarrow, all purchased from the hardware store on the main street. I worked from first light to last light every day. My hands blistered in the first 2 days, and the blisters tore, and the skin beneath them hardened into something tougher than what had been there before. My back developed a constant deep ache, not the sharp pain of an injury, but the grinding complaint of a body being asked to perform work it had not been conditioned for. I ate canned food heated on a small camp stove, and I slept in my sleeping bag on the cold ground inside the foundation ruins, and I woke every morning stiff and cold and got up anyway. There were days that tested the decision in ways I had not anticipated. I would spend 8 hours moving rock and stand back at the end of the day and look at the progress I had made and feel the scale of the remaining task as a physical weight. On those days, the voice that had been present since the dormitory, the voice that knew the $20,000 was still available and that a reasonable person would take it, got louder. It told me I was a philosophy student who had never worked with his hands in any serious way, and that this was not a story about someone like me. On those days, I would stop and open the notebook in my jacket pocket. I had been copying passages from Ray's journals into it as I read them each evening, the ones that seemed to carry the most weight. I had one that I returned to more than any other, written in February of 1991, the month the cabin burned. He had written, "They burned the house tonight." Got out with the coat on my back and the boots on my feet, stood in the snow and watched it go. First thought was that they had won. Second thought was that I was still standing. There is a difference between those two things, and it is worth remembering. I remembered it. I picked up the pickaxe and I kept going. On the 11th day, without prior notice or any communication, a dark green truck appeared at the gate below. It had a lumber rack on the bed and moved up the road with the patience of a vehicle driven by someone who knew the road well. The man who got out was Fergus Braille from the general store. He walked up the slope in the unhurried way of someone who is accustomed to hills and stopped a few feet away from where I was working. He looked at the cleared and leveled pad I had been building. He looked at the cliff face above it. When he looked at me, his expression had shifted from the assessment he had worn on the main street to something that was not quite its opposite, but was measurably different. The suspension of a judgment that had been there before. He said, "You're Ray Vance's grandson." "I am," I said. He looked at the pad again. "He said I knew your grandfather." "Not well." He kept to himself. "Buddy had coffee at my counter every Tuesday morning for about 20 years. He nodded once as though confirming something he had been thinking about. Then he walked back down to his truck and opened the tailgate and began unloading bags of concrete mix, stacking them near the base of the slope with the efficiency of someone who has handled heavy bags many times. He did not explain himself. He did not ask if the help was wanted. When he was done, he got back in the truck and drove away down the road. I stood looking at the concrete bags. They were exactly the grade and precisely the quantity I needed for the foundation slab. The Quonset kit arrived 2 days later on a flatbed that barely made the turns on the logging road. The driver looked at the slope and the rutted track and declined to take the truck any further than the gate. He unloaded the entire shipment, their palletized steel panels and bundled arch struts and hardware packages, and drove away. The gate was a quarter-mile from the building site, and every inch of that quarter-mile was steep and rocky and offered no flat section where a loaded wheelbarrow could rest without sliding. I spent 2 full days hauling pieces up the slope one at a time. Each curved steel panel was heavy and awkward, the shape designed for strength rather than transportability, and the wheelbarrow caught on every root and stone. On the afternoon of the second day, with the last half-dozen panels still at the gate, I heard footsteps on the slope behind me. Fergus Braille was coming up, moving steadily. Behind him was a man I did not recognize, lean and weathered, wearing a canvas work jacket with a hammer hanging from the belt. Fergus walked to the panel I had been struggling with, took the far end without saying anything, and started carrying. The other man took the opposite end. I grabbed the next panel and followed. We moved all the remaining steel in under an hour. When it was done, we were all breathing hard in the thin air, and none of us had said more than a few words during the entire operation. The man with the hammer was Cal Drett. He had been a carpenter in Coldridge for 30 years, working jobs that ranged from repair and renovation to custom cabinetry to the kind of structural work that required both skill and patience. He had a handshake that was serious about the task and eyes that were evaluative without being unfriendly. He looked at the leveled pad and the cliff face and the stacked materials for a moment in the way that someone who has spent decades looking at construction problems looks at a new one. He said, "You're going to need help with the arches. The steel is too heavy and too awkward to walk upright by yourself." "I know," I said. He took the hammer from his belt and turned it once in his hand. "Be here at 6, he said. He arrived at 5:55. Pouring the foundation slab took 2 days. Fergus brought a portable concrete mixer in the bed of his truck, and the three of us worked through both days in the focused silence that develops between people doing physical work that requires coordination and attention. Cal showed me how to set the forms correctly, how to use a long straight edge to check for level across the full span of the pour, how to screed the surface, and how to finish it with a trowel so that it cured with the smoothness and density a slab needed to carry structural load. His instruction was not patient in the conventional sense. He did not repeat himself, and he did not offer reassurance. But his corrections were precise, and they were given without impatience, the pedagogy of someone for whom the doing of things correctly is itself the point independent of any social consideration. When the slab had cured, we began on the arches. The process required assembling each arch flat on the slab from its curved panel components, bolting them together in sequence, and then walking the completed arch upright, which required coordinated effort between at least 2 people before anchoring it to the hardware embedded in the concrete. Cal and I held the arches while Fergus drove the anchor bolts, and we developed over the course of several days a wordless working rhythm, the kind that forms between people who are paying attention to the same problem. The structure rose from the slab arch by arch. The corrugated steel caught the light differently at different times of day, silver and pale in the morning, warmer in the afternoon, and against the gray face of the granite cliff. It looked both improbable and inevitable, the way things look when they belong somewhere, even if they were not originally designed for that particular somewhere. We were midway through attaching the third arch when the county vehicle appeared on the logging road. The inspector was a man in his 50s named Gruber, according to his badge. He had a clipboard in the expression of someone who had been sent with a purpose and intended to fulfill it. He walked the perimeter of the structure twice, stopping to examine the foundation, the anchor hardware, the panel connections. He asked to see the permit. I had laminated the agricultural storage permit and posted it on a piece of plywood at the site entrance as the code required. I showed it to him. He said the structure appeared to be designed for habitation rather than storage. I said I was constructing a secure facility for the storage of agricultural equipment and materials related to land management on the property. He looked at the sleeping bag and camp stove visible through the open end of the structure. I said I sometimes stayed on site overnight to protect my equipment and materials. The agricultural use designation permitted on-site presence by the property owner for purposes related to the designated use. He made a note. He said the permit did not authorize permanent electrical installation. I said I had no permanent electrical installation, which he could verify by looking. He walked the property boundary. He stopped at the survey stakes that Ridgeline surveyors had installed along the eastern boundary line 3 weeks earlier in the night, without notification to me as the property owner. I had found them at first light the morning after they were installed when I went to retrieve a tool I had left near the property edge, and I had spent the rest of that day photographing each stake with GPS coordinates and timestamps running on my phone. And I had driven into town that afternoon and filed the photographs in a formal written objection to any resurvey conducted without proper notice to the property owner with the county assessor's office. I had done this before telling Clara, before mentioning it to anyone, because I understood that the window for creating the record was narrow and closing, and that if I did not create it immediately, it would not exist. Gruber looked at the stakes. He said nothing about them directly. He went back to his truck and wrote on his clipboard for several minutes. Then he looked up at me from the window. He said the permit is in order. The structure meets the specifications for the agricultural designation. He paused. Mr. Vance, my job is to enforce the code as written. He paused again, and what he said next was careful in the specific way of a person who is communicating something without technically saying it. He said, you might want to make sure your documentation stays current. Things can move quickly around here. He drove away. Fergus came around from the far side of the structure where he had been working during the inspection. He looked at me. He said those boundary stakes. You filed on those yourself. I did, I said. He looked at me for a moment, the same look he had given the foundation pad on the first day. The removal of something rather than the addition of something. He nodded and went back to work. That night alone in the structure with the front end still open to the weather and the temperature falling toward frost for the first time, I lay in my sleeping bag on the cured concrete and read through more of Ray's journals by headlamp. I had been reading them in chronological order, a few entries each night, moving through the decades of his record keeping. The way you read a long account that you understand will matter more as it progresses. In a journal from 2008, I found the entry I had not been looking for and would not have known to look for. The handwriting was mid-career, Ray steady and economical before the slight tremor of his later years. The date was April 14th, 2008. The entry said, found the pipe. He had been walking the northern edge of the property near the cliff base after a heavy rain that had washed some surface soil away, and he had noticed the top of a pipe exposed in the ground. He had followed it. The pipe ran from a point near the cliff base, underground, under the property boundary on the eastern side, and toward the area where Ridgeline had begun construction activities that year. He had returned with a camera and documented the pipe's route with photographs. He had hired under a false name a water testing company from the next county and had them analyze water from the spring source he had been monitoring on his property for years. The analysis returned a specific mineral signature that matched water from that spring and no other source in the area. Ridgeline had run a pipe under his land under the boundary line and was drawing from his spring source without his knowledge or consent. They had been doing it continuously from 2008 or earlier, and they had been bottling and selling the water under a brand label that had grown steadily more commercially successful in the intervening 16 years. This was the fourth mark. This was what $20,000 was actually buying. I set the journal down on the concrete beside me and looked at the curved steel ceiling of the Quonset, barely visible in the beam of my headlamp. Outside, the wind had come up and was moving through the high pines with the sound of distant, continuous water. Ray had known since 2008. He had documented it with the same methodical care he brought to everything else, and he had added the documentation to the room in the cliff, and he had continued to refuse every offer year after year, knowing that every year he held the land he was sitting on evidence of a federal crime. He could not have used that evidence himself. He had no legal standing as a private citizen to compel any investigation that Ridgeline's lawyers could not have delayed or discredited. He needed the land to be in the hands of someone who owned it free and clear, someone who could authorize access to investigators on terms that would hold up. He had needed someone to come. I picked up the journal again and read the end of the April 14th entry. At the bottom, in smaller letters that suggested he was writing for himself rather than for the record, he had written, "I wonder sometimes if any of this will be enough. If what I am building here is enough to matter after I'm gone." Then I remember that the question is not about enough. It is about whether something is true. The truth of a thing does not require a witness to remain true. I know what they did. The record is here. Someday someone will read it. I was reading it. The snow came in the third week of October, early and heavy, arriving overnight, so that I woke to a different world than the one I had gone to sleep in. I turned on my headlamp in the dark and heard before I saw it a low, strained sound from somewhere above me, the sound of steel under load. I got up and got my headlamp fixed to my head and worked my way out through the open front end of the Quonset and looked up. The arch nearest the open end was flexing visibly under the weight of wet, dense snow that had accumulated faster than the design expected in an unfinished structure. I got the snow rake from inside a tool I had bought from Fergus's store 3 days earlier, when the forecast changed, and I spent the next 2 hours on the roof in the dark, working by the beam of the headlamp, clearing the accumulation in sections, while more came down around me. My gloves soaked through in the first 20 minutes. By the end of the 2 hours, I could not feel my fingers with any reliability. But the structure held. In the morning, there were 8 inches on the ground, and the temperature had dropped to the low 20s, and the open front end of the Quonset was admitting wind-driven snow through the gap. The end walls had to happen before the next storm. I had the lumber and window units on order at the hardware store waiting, because I had planned to do the end wall work during a dry spell that had not arrived. I walked down to Fergus's store and explained the situation. He moved around behind the counter and wrote something on a piece of paper and slid it across to me. It was Cal Drett's name and phone number. I called Cal. He said he would be there at 7 the next morning. He was there at 6:45. He had already arranged pickup of the materials from the hardware store, loading them himself into his truck bed. He looked at the open front end and the weather coming off the peaks and pulled out his tape measure without preamble. We built the end walls over 2 days. Cal worked with the economy and precision of someone who has long since moved past thinking about how to do things and thinks only about what he is doing. He showed me how to frame a window opening properly, how to account for the weight of the window unit and the direction of the load, how to hang a door in a frame so that it seated squarely and operated true in all weather. By the end of the second day, the front end was closed. The door hung and latched. The windows were in. What had been a steel tube open to the weather was something that could reasonably be called a building. I lit the wood stove for the first time that evening. The heat moved out from it slowly and then with gathering confidence as the metal of the stove reached operating temperature. The interior of the Quonset changed character as the warmth spread into it. It became interior rather than merely enclosed. The light from the stove's glass door panel moved across the concrete floor and up the curved, corrugated steel of the ceiling, and across the face of the granite at the back wall, the cliff my wall and where the crystals in the rock caught the light. They sparkled faintly briefly, like something alive in the stone. Cal and I stood looking at what the structure had become. He said your grandfather used to say that land would tell you what it needed if you were quiet enough to listen to it. I looked at the cliff behind us and said nothing. Cal put on his coat and gathered his tools. At the door he stopped. He said Ridgeline is going to push harder now that winter's here. They do it every year with the people who are holding out on them. They wait for the cold to do the persuading. They wait for the money to run out, or the will to run out, or both. I asked how he knew that. He said because I watched them do it to your grandfather for 20 years. He nodded once and went out into the dark. I stood alone in the building. The stove breathed and ticked. The granite sparkled faintly. The wind found the small gaps around the window frames and spoke through them at a low and constant pitch. I understood then for the first time with the full weight of understanding that the structure was not only shelter. It was a position. It was a thing I had built with my own hands and with the help of people who had decided for their own reasons that this particular position was worth helping to hold. It said I am here. Whatever comes next, I am still here. I went to the shelving unit I had built along the interior wall, and I opened Ray's 2008 journal to the pipe entry and read it again. Then I got out the notebook where I kept my lists, and I opened to the page where I had written at the top, in the largest letters I had written anything in months, the fourth mark. Below it were questions. Below the questions were names. One of the names was Agent Sandra Pruitt. I had found it in one of Ray's later journals, the mid-2000s, a contact he had identified and researched but never approached. An EPA agent based in the Denver field office who had been, according to what Ray had been able to determine from publicly available information, quietly building a case against Ridgeline Corporation regarding water rights violations in multiple states. Ray had written her name and her office address, and next to it in his careful hand, not yet. Need the land secured first. The land was secured. Preston Cole came back in November. He came alone this time in a rental car that was entirely wrong for the condition of the logging road and showed it in the way it moved. He walked up the slope to the Quonset in a coat that was expensive and not warm enough for the temperature, and he stopped at the door. I opened it from the inside. He looked at the building. He stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the wood stove with its pipe running through the steel wall, at the stack of firewood against the side of the structure, at the windows with light behind them, and the door that swung true and latched clean. He looked at what I had built, and something in his face that was not the smile moved briefly and then was still again. He said, "We have a new offer. $50,000. I said nothing. He said, "Eli, you are a smart person and you are 21 years old and you have your entire life ahead of you. $50,000 is a foundation. It is a start that most people your age do not get handed to them." I said my grandfather was 26 when your company's predecessor destroyed his back and his livelihood and blacklisted him out of every job he was qualified for. He had 50,000 ahead of him too, in the sense of potential. It turned out differently than the word implies. Something moved in Cole's jaw. Very small, very controlled, but I had been watching for it for the entire length of the conversation. He said, "We can make your situation here very difficult. Legally, logistically. We have resources that you do not have, and we are prepared to use them." I said, "I know." He said then, "Be sensible." I said my grandfather held this land for 33 years on what he made working odd jobs in a small mountain town. I have a concrete slab and 4 walls and enough firewood to get through the winter. I think I can hold it a little longer than he did if it comes to that. Cole looked at me for a long moment. The last of the smile was gone. What was underneath it was not quite anger and not quite respect, but it contained elements of both, and it was more honest than anything he had shown me in our previous conversation. He put his hands in his coat pockets. He said, "We will be in touch." He walked back down the slope. I watched until the rental car had rounded the bend and disappeared into the trees. Then I went back inside, added a log to the stove, and sat down at the small table I had built along one wall with the journal from 2008 open in front of me and the notebook beside it. I found the current EPA field office contact for Denver through the library computer the next morning. Ray's journal had a phone number that was 4 years old, and a phone call left no record, and Ray had taught me without intending to. That documentation was the foundation of everything. I wrote a letter, 2 pages factual and without embellishment, explaining who I was and what I had found. I included a single photograph of the pipe documentation from the 2008 journal entry. I addressed it to Agent Sandra Pruitt, and I asked her to contact Clara Wyndham if she wanted to pursue the matter. Then I went back up the hill and I kept working. December in the high country is not a season in the way that December is a season in lower elevations. It is a condition total and uncompromising that reorganizes the priorities of everything that lives in it. The snow came and stayed, adding to itself in layers covering the ground to depths that required constant management. The temperature dropped into ranges where exposed skin reported the situation quickly and with urgency. The walk between the gate and the Quonset became an undertaking that required full preparation, and preparation required knowledge that I had not had in September and had to acquire by necessity. I learned to layer correctly. Cal had told me the basics on the second week: the wicking layer next to the skin, the insulating layer over it, the wind layer on the outside, and never cotton anywhere, because cotton held moisture, and moisture was dangerous at these temperatures. I bought better gloves from Fergus's store, and I learned which paths up the slope were navigable in deep snow and which were not. And I learned the difference in sound between snow that would hold my weight and snow that would not. The Quonset was warm. The wood stove was the center of everything, the thing the entire system of surviving winter organized itself around. I had cut and split 2 cords of firewood in October, hauling the rounds up the slope in the wheelbarrow before the hard freeze made the track impossible, stacking them against the south wall of the structure under a tarp. The stove was small, but the Quonset was also small and well insulated by the cliff face that formed its back wall, the granite holding and returning heat with the slow generosity of something with enormous thermal mass. Even on the coldest nights, I could keep the interior temperature livable on a single overnight burn. I had water from the spring that Ray had marked on his map fed through a hand pump, and a pipeline I had run and insulated and buried below the frost line where it crossed exposed ground. It was crude and imperfect, and it worked. I had my grandfather's journals. I read through all of them that winter. From the first one dated 1989, written in a hand that was shaky and raw, with the specific desperation of a man who has just had everything taken away and does not yet know what the shape of his life is going to be, to the last one dated February of the previous year. The handwriting slow and careful, but still precise. The thought still clear. 35 years of one person's inner life rendered in the way that people render things when they are writing for themselves, rather than for an audience, without the social modifications that change the shape of what is said. He had not been a sentimental writer. He did not describe his emotional states the way people describe them when they are aware of being read. He wrote the way someone writes when they are trying to understand something, setting down observations and questions and occasional conclusions. But the picture that accumulated across 35 years of notebooks was more complete in some ways than the portraits of people I had known in person, because it contained no performance. Nothing in it had been shaped for effect. He had been lonely consistently and in a particular way. Not the dramatic loneliness of a wrong person in a story, but the specific grinding loneliness of a life lived at the margins of other people's lives, close enough to observe but never close enough to touch. He had followed my mother's life from a distance for years, assembling what information he could from public records and occasional careful inquiry, knowing when she married and where she lived, and working with the limited information available to him to stay oriented to her existence without intruding on it. He had driven to Denver once in the late 90s and parked on the street outside the apartment building where she was living and sat in the truck for 2 hours and then driven home without getting out. She had been pregnant with me at the time. He had not known that. He had written about the drive home with the particular flatness of a person who is recording something they cannot afford to let themselves feel fully. He had loved my grandmother, and he had failed her, and he knew both of those things with equal clarity and held them together without resolving the contradiction because there was no resolution available. He had made the wrong choice at a moment when it mattered enormously, and then he had spent the rest of his life in the aftermath of that choice, not as a person consumed by regret, but as a person who had accepted the consequences and continued to act within them as well as he could. He had kept going. That was the thing I came back to through the long winter evenings by the stove. Not because he was heroic, not because justice sustained him spiritually in any way he was able to articulate. He had kept going because stopping would have meant that the people who had taken everything from him would have also taken his capacity to resist, and that was the one thing he was not going to give them. Clara called in the second week of December. Her voice was steady and careful. She said, "Agent Sandra Pruitt called my office this morning. She received your letter. She wanted me to tell you that she will be in contact. And then she said, Eli, I need to tell you something she told me. Ridgeline Corporation has been under joint investigation by the EPA and FBI for the past 2 years. Water rights violations across Colorado, Wyoming, and New Mexico. She said what you provided was, and this is her word, significant. I said it means Ray's records are what they need. She said it means what your grandfather built in that room may be the center of a federal enforcement case. And it means that Ridgeline is going to find out that the investigation is accelerating. When that happens, they will move fast and hard to protect their position. I said they have been pressuring me since September. She said this will be different from pressure. She was right. The filing arrived through Clara's office in the third week of December from a law firm in Denver with 5 names on the letterhead. Ridgeline was asserting a civil claim in county court that the 1991 deed transfer of the Vance property had been defective due to an unresolved easement claim filed by a predecessor company in 1988. They were seeking a stay of occupancy pending resolution. If granted, I would have 72 hours to vacate. Clara called me within the hour of receiving it. She said the case was technically contestable, but that the proceeding would require someone to appear and argue it, and that her ability to represent me was compromised because she held documents that were now part of a federal evidentiary chain, and her simultaneous appearance in county court on my behalf would give Ridgeline's lawyers a basis to challenge both proceedings. I said, "You're telling me I need to do this myself." She said, "I'm telling you the situation. I went to the library. I spent 3 full days reading Colorado property law. Not the broad overview, but the specific statutes, the ones that govern deed, transfer defects in easement recording requirements, and the procedural standards for a stay of occupancy in a civil boundary dispute. I read the case law that the relevant statutes had generated. On the second evening, I found a Colorado Supreme Court decision from 1987, Harlan versus Meridian Land Trust, which established that a deed transfer could not be challenged on procedural defect grounds after the transferee had taken continuous occupancy of the property and made documented improvements, provided the original deed had been properly recorded. Ray's deed had been properly recorded. I had been in continuous occupancy since September. The foundation slab, the Quonset structure, the permit filings, all of it was documented with the county. I assembled my documents that night in the Quonset by the stove. I read them in sequence. I thought about the argument and the counter-arguments and how the counter-arguments could be answered. I stayed up until the stove needed a second feeding and then a third, and by the time I lay down in my sleeping bag, the argument was clear in my head and I thought I could make it hold. The hearing was Thursday morning. The county courthouse was a single-story building at the east edge of town with a parking lot that held 8 cars and a flagpole with a Colorado state flag that moved steadily in the mountain wind. The Ridgeline legal team arrived in 2 vehicles, 3 men in suits that were inappropriate for the temperature-carrying briefcases, with the efficiency of people who do this every day in courtrooms, considerably more impressive than this one. I walked from the gate. I was wearing the cleanest clothes I had. My hands were calloused and there were traces of concrete ground into the skin around my nails that no amount of scrubbing had been able to fully remove. When I walked into the courtroom, Fergus Braille and Cal Drett were sitting in the gallery. I had not told them about the hearing. Clara had, which meant she had decided what kind of support was possible to provide, even when the legal kind was not available to her. I looked at them as I came through the door. Fergus gave me the smallest possible nod. Cal looked at the folder of documents in my hand and then looked back at the front of the room. I sat alone at the respondents' table. The judge was named Whitfield. He was in his early 70s with a face that had the texture of weathered stone and the patience of someone who has presided over 1,000 proceedings and has stopped allowing any of them to impress him. He looked at the Ridgeline team. He looked at me. He looked at my folder. He said, "I see the respondent is appearing pro se." I said, "Yes, Your Honor." He said, "Are you aware of the procedural complexity of the claim being made against you?" I said, "I've done my best to prepare, Your Honor." He considered me for a moment with the specific attention of someone who is deciding whether the thing in front of them is what it appears to be. Then he said, "Proceed." The lead attorney for Ridgeline was a man named Garrison. He was fluent and precise, the kind of legal argument that is constructed to sound not merely correct, but inevitable. He laid out the claim the 1991 deed transfer from the original Vance holding to Raymond Vance had included a title search that, had he argued, failed to identify and account for an easement claim filed by a predecessor company in 1988. This unresolved prior claim constituted a cloud on the title that had persisted through all subsequent transfers, rendering the current transfer to me defective and subject to judicial review. He cited 6 cases, he presented exhibits, he spoke for 22 minutes, and when he sat down, the room was quiet in the specific way of a room that has heard something that sounds like a conclusion. Judge Whitfield looked at me. I stood up. I said, "Your Honor, the claim rests entirely on the existence of an easement filed in 1988. I would like to address that directly." I removed the first document from my folder and placed it on the bench. I said, under Colorado Statute 3841-108, an easement claim that has not been recorded in the county where the subject property is located is void against a subsequent purchaser who takes the property without actual notice of the claim. I have a certified copy of the county recorder's records from 1991 showing that no easement was recorded against this parcel in this county at the time of the deed transfer. The easement that Ridgeline's counsel references was filed in a different county as part of what they have described as a consolidated proceeding. Garrison was on his feet immediately. He said the consolidated filing had legal effect across the affected parcels regardless of the county of filing. I said Colorado statute is explicit that easements against real property must be recorded in the county where the property is located to have legal effect on title in that county. A filing in another county has no effect on title here. I cited the recording statute. I cited the Harlan decision. I put both documents on the bench. The room was quiet again, but in a different way. Whitfield read the documents. He read them carefully the way judges read things when they are actually reading them rather than performing the act of reading. He asked Garrison 2 questions. Garrison answered both of them with noticeably less fluency than he had shown in his opening. Whitfield read a little more. He said the respondent's citation of Harlan versus Meridian Land Trust is applicable to the facts of this proceeding. Continuous occupancy and documented improvements have been established on the record. The easement argument fails on the recording requirement as stated in the relevant statute. Motion for stay of occupancy is denied. He closed the folder. He said, without looking at Garrison counsel, may wish to review the recording statute requirements before bringing a similar proceeding in this court in the future. He stood and the room stood with him, and then he was gone through the door behind the bench. I stood at the respondent's table and let the air out of my chest slowly. The Ridgeline attorneys were packing their briefcases with the controlled efficiency of people processing a loss they had not expected and were not going to discuss. Garrison did not look at me. Fergus and Cal came through the gallery gate. Fergus put his hand on my shoulder for a moment, the same gesture he had used on the building site, the contact that communicated what he was not going to put into words. Cal looked at the documents I was putting back in my folder. He said, philosophy degree. I said, mostly property law this week. He made a sound that I had learned over the months was the closest he came to laughing. He put on his coat and went out through the door, and Fergus followed him. And I gathered my documents and followed them out into the January cold, into the mountain air that was clear and very bright, and smelled of pine and the specific mineral sharpness of snow. Agent Pruitt came to Coldridge in February. She drove herself in a government vehicle, and she met with Clara and me in the small office above the hardware store for 3 hours. She was compact and direct, with short dark hair, and the manner of someone who has learned to gather information efficiently without signaling the direction of her interest. She asked questions carefully, and she listened to complete answers before asking the next question, which is rarer than it sounds. She had already reviewed the materials from the cliff room. Clara had provided organized copies with a formal chain of custody document 6 weeks earlier. Pruitt said that the pipe documentation from 2008 was consistent with evidence her team had been building independently across 3 states, that Ridgeline had been diverting water from private sources throughout the region and misrepresenting those sources in their state and federal environmental filings. Ray's documentation was the most complete single-source record of a specific ongoing diversion they had found, with dated photographs, water testing results, and pipe routing documentation all in one coherent evidentiary package. She said your grandfather understood that bringing this forward himself would have resulted in the evidence being challenged on standing grounds. He was correct about that. Evidence held by a property owner and provided to federal investigators through proper channels is different in a way that matters. She paused and looked at me with a directness that was professional but not impersonal. She said, I want to ask you something outside the scope of the investigation. You are 21 years old, and you spent a winter alone on a mountain building a structure with your hands and teaching yourself property law in a public library. And you walked into a county courthouse and defeated a corporate legal team on procedural grounds. What is it that you are actually trying to do here? What do you want this to become? I thought about the question for a moment. I said my grandfather wanted the land to stay wild. He thought its value was that it had not been developed, that there was still one piece of this mountain that had not been bought and converted into something profitable. I want to honor that. But the spring is real, and it is producing water that has been tested and that is genuinely clean, and I think there is a way to use that in a way that works with the land rather than against it. Something small and sustainable. Nothing like what Ridgeline was doing. She said you've had time to think about this. I said it was a long winter. She put her pen in her jacket pocket and stood. She shook hands with Clara and then with me. She said she would be in touch through Clara's office. After she left, Clara closed the door and stood for a moment with her back against it. Then she went to her desk and opened the bottom drawer and removed a folder and held it for a moment before she set it on the desk between us. She said, Eli, when I was cataloging the materials from the cliff room, I found something that was not part of the evidence package. It was tucked between the pages of the last journal, the February journal. A letter. She opened the folder. Inside was a piece of paper, lightweight writing paper, of the kind that was common before email made letter writing rare, covered in Ray's handwriting, younger and steadier than his late journals. Dated 1995. She said it's addressed to your mother. I looked at the letter on the desk. She said, I don't know whether you want to read it alone. I can step out. I said, stay. I picked it up. It began Sarah. Not dear Sarah. Not my daughter. Just her name, the same directness he had shown at the top of my letter, as though the name itself contained everything that a formal address would have said, and more. He wrote, I have been trying for 3 years to find a current address for you. The last one I had was a year out of date by the time it reached me. I understand that you have moved again, and I understand why that kind of moving feels necessary, and I am not writing because I expect this to reach you. I am writing because some things need to be said even when the saying of them has no destination. He wrote, I did not leave you, Sarah. I want you to know that even though knowing it changes nothing about what your life has been without me in it, and even though I have no right to ask you to believe me after this much time, I left the situation. I left because I had been broken and I had nothing to bring home, and I had too much pride and too little sense to understand that coming home with nothing is still coming home. By the time I understood that it was too late to come back without explaining, and explaining meant putting you in the path of people who had already shown me they were willing to do serious things to protect their interests. He wrote, "Your mother was a good woman, and I failed her, and I failed you, and I hold that every day. It is not a comfortable thing to hold, and I am not asking for relief from it. I am just telling you that the failure was mine, not yours, and that you were not left because you were not enough. You were left because I was not brave enough at the moment when bravery was what the situation required." He wrote, "I think about you every day, Sarah. I know that sounds like the kind of thing a man says when he wants to be forgiven, but I am not asking you to forgive me. I am just telling you what is true. The last time I saw you, you were 4 years old, and you were wearing a yellow coat, and you were trying to teach the dog a trick it didn't know, and you were completely serious about it, completely concentrated, and I thought this child is going to be something. I have thought about that yellow coat for 30 years. He wrote, "I have a piece of land in the mountains. It is mostly rock, and it is not comfortable, and I do not pretend it is much. But it is mine, and it is clean, and the water that comes off it is the cleanest water I have ever tasted, and I am holding it for whoever comes after me. I hope that person carries something of yours in them. I hope they have your seriousness. That is the thing that lasts." He wrote, "I am sorry, Sarah. I know there is no version of enough when it comes to that. But I love you, and I have always loved you, and I could not find my way back to a place where you could see it. It was signed your father." Claire was standing at the window, her back to me, giving me the privacy that the small room could offer. My mother had died not knowing. She had grown up believing her father had walked away from her because he had chosen to, because she and her mother had not been sufficient reason to stay. She had carried that belief through her entire life, through her childhood, and whatever her early adulthood had been before the accident on a Tuesday morning in October. Through the years she had spent raising me, carrying me and loving me with the specific intensity of someone who had been left and was determined that the person in her care would not be. She had died with the wrong version of the story on a Tuesday morning when I was 6 years old, and she had never known that the version was wrong, that her father had not left because he wanted to, but had been driven away and had spent 30 years trying to find the address that kept moving before him. I sat in Clara's chair with Ray's letter to my mother in my hands, and I cried. I had not cried in front of another person since I was very small. Not at the dormitory, not on the bus, not through any of the months on the mountain. But I sat in that small office in Coldridge in February, and I cried for my mother, who deserved to know the truth and had never been told it, and for my grandfather, who had carried the weight of the untold truth as the final and heaviest item on a very long list of things he carried, and for the letter written in 1995 that had been tucked into a journal in the last month of a man's life, because there had never been anywhere else for it to go. Clara did not speak. She stood at the window and let me have it. That was exactly the right thing to do, and she knew it. After a while, I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the folder. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. I looked at the desk and the window, and the ordinary winter afternoon visible through the glass, the main street of Coldridge quiet in the cold, the ridge visible above the rooftops, everything continuing in its ordinary way. I said she never knew. Clara said no. I said she died carrying the wrong story. Clara said yes. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, I want the letter kept safe, separately from the evidence materials. It's not evidence, it's just his. She said, of course. She put the folder back in the drawer and closed it. The enforcement action came in March. It came the way these things come when they have been building for a long time under the surface all at once, in multiple directions without warning. On a Wednesday morning in early March, federal agents arrived simultaneously at Ridgeline Corporation's headquarters in Denver, at 3 active project sites in Colorado, and at 2 sites in Wyoming. Simultaneously, the company's operating accounts were frozen pending the outcome of the investigation. Simultaneously, Preston Cole was served with a federal subpoena at his home at 6 in the morning. I was splitting the last of the winter firewood behind the Quonset when my phone rang. The season was turning and the pile was almost gone, and the work felt like the completion of something. Clara said Sandra Pruitt called this morning. It's happening. I set down the splitting axe. She said, I want you to know something specific. The water diversion on your property is one of 11 counts in the enforcement filing. Raymond's documentation is cited as corroborating evidence in 7 of those counts. She paused. His name is in the federal record, Eli. After 33 years, Raymond Vance's name is in the official record of this. I said, thank you, Clara. She said, don't thank me. I answered phones and filed paperwork. Your grandfather spent 3 decades in a trailer building the case that made this possible. You spent a winter on a concrete slab learning how to finish it. The legal proceedings against Ridgeline would take years to fully resolve. I knew that going in. Federal enforcement cases involving corporate defendants with significant resources do not move quickly, and I had learned enough about how these things work to understand that the resolution was a horizon rather than a door. But the enforcement action changed the immediate situation completely. The pressure campaign against individual landholders in the region stopped. The offers stopped coming. The lawyers stopped calling. The county inspector did not return. What came in April in an envelope with an official federal return address was a letter outlining the compensation process for property owners whose water sources had been diverted by Ridgeline without consent. The calculation would be based on the volume diverted, the duration of the diversion, and the commercial value of that water based on Ridgeline's actual sales records. The process would take time. The letter was addressed to Eli Vance, property owner, Coldridge, Colorado, and it was clear and official and real. I read it sitting on the front step of the Quonset in the April sunshine. The snow had retreated to the highest elevations, and the scrub pine on the hillside was producing new growth. The tips of the branches a lighter, brighter green than the established needles, the specific green of things beginning again. Below the gate, I could see the valley and the town and the road that had brought me here in September, and the ridge beyond the town, and above the ridge, the sky very blue and very clear. The cliff behind me was warm in the morning sun. I could feel the heat of it through the back wall of the Quonset, the granite radiating what it had absorbed through the cold months, giving it back now that the season allowed. The spring was running well. I had walked up to check it that morning, a habit I had developed over the winter, and the water was coming through the granite clean and cold, and with the specific quality that Ray had documented and that the testing confirmed. It had been coming through that rock for longer than there had been anyone to drink it or document it or fight over the right to take it, and it would be coming through long after all of the current argument had been resolved and forgotten. I went inside and made coffee on the camp stove and sat on the concrete floor with my back against the granite wall and Ray's last journal open across my knees. I read the final entry dated the previous February, 3 months before he died. The handwriting slow and formed with effort but still precise, the thought still tracking cleanly through the slower instrument of his late hand. He had written, I am tired in the way that sleep doesn't address anymore. That's all right. I have done what I could with what I had in the time I had to do it. The room is organized, the box is in the ground. Whoever comes will know what to do with it, or they won't. And that is the part I cannot control, and I have been trying to control it for 30 years, and I am finished trying. I am going to let the land be what it is. He had written, the spring is running clean this week. I walked up to check it yesterday morning. That water has been coming through that rock for longer than anyone alive can account for, and it will be coming through long after Ridgeline and I are both settled and gone. There is something in that worth holding on to. I cannot say precisely what it is, but there is something. He had not written anything after that. Whatever he had intended to say next, he had not gotten to. The rest of the page was blank, and the pages after it were blank, and then the journal was finished. I closed it. Outside, Cal Drett's truck was coming up the road. He had offered to help me build out the interior of the Quonset properly, now that the season was turning insulation and interior wall panels, and the plumbing connections that would make the hand pump system permanent and reliable. It was the kind of work that turned a structure into something that could last and Cal was the right person to do it with. Further down the slope, I could see Fergus Braille's truck at the gate. He had mentioned without quite saying it directly that there was a piece of property 2 miles north of the Vance parcel, a small meadow with a year-round stream running through it that the family who owned it was considering selling. He had mentioned it in the way he mentioned things he thought were worth knowing, without pressure or explanation, letting the information find its own level. I had been in contact with a sustainability consultant in Boulder who had agreed to look at the spring output data and the land's carrying capacity and help me think through what a small, responsible water enterprise would actually look like in practice. Not what Ridgeline had done, not the industrial extraction that had required pipes run secretly under someone else's land, but something that worked with the natural output of the source rather than against it. Something that could be explained and defended, and that Ray would have recognized as being in the spirit of what he had been protecting. The compensation from the water diversion finding when it was calculated would give me the means to begin. Not extravagantly, not in a way that required the land to be anything other than what it was, but in a way that could sustain itself and contribute something to the community that had, without being asked, decided that this particular position was worth helping to hold. I stood up from the concrete floor and took the carved sparrow out of my jacket pocket. I had been carrying it there since November, the twin of the one my mother had kept on her bedside table, and the constant handling had worn the wood smooth in the places my fingers found most naturally, the breast, the curve of the folded wing. The detail was still there underneath the smoothness, every feather line that Ray had made with the specific tool and the specific patience of someone who understands that the material requires time and that rushing it produces something that is correct in outline but wrong in the particular. Two birds carved from the same wood by the same hands, one given to his daughter and one buried in the ground for decades in a metal box under the ruins of a burned cabin waiting. The hands that made them had also made the door in the mountain and organized the shelves and written the journals and composed the letters and refused through 33 years of pressure and isolation and cold and the constant proximity of an easier choice to sign the paper that would have made it stop. I held the bird in the April sun for a moment. The granite was warm behind me. The spring was running clean somewhere above in the cliff face. Cal's truck had reached the gate and I could hear the engine stop and the door open. I put the sparrow back in my pocket where it lived now, and I went to work.